Nancy, a racist flight attendant, slaps a black man named Jeremiah mid-flight, causing tensions to explode in the cabin, not knowing he is a billionaire. As more passengers begin to reveal startling truths, her actions lead to consequences far beyond what she could have imagined. How will this confrontation change not only her life, but the lives of everyone on board? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Jeremiah Ford stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie with steady hands. The early morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow on his thoughtful face. He took a deep breath, his dark eyes meeting their reflection with a mix of determination and weariness. Another day, another chance to make a difference, he murmured to himself, smoothing down his crisp white shirt. As he picked up his suitcase, Jeremiah's gaze lingered on a framed photo on his dresser. It showed him surrounded by smiling children from the community center he'd helped build in his old neighborhood. A small smile tugged at his lips, reminding him of why he pushed himself so hard. Jeremiah made his way downstairs, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. In the kitchen, he poured himself a quick cup of coffee, savoring the rich aroma. As he sipped the hot liquid, his phone buzzed with a notification. Another news article about his latest business venture popped up on the screen. He sighed, setting the cup down. "Can't catch a break, can I?" he said softly, scrolling through the comments. Some praised his work, while others questioned his motives. The weight of public scrutiny pressed down on his shoulders. A familiar but unwelcome companion. Shaking off the negativity, Jeremiah grabbed his luggage and headed out the door. The crisp morning air filled his lungs as he walked to his car, reminding him of the fresh start each day brought. As he drove to the airport, Jeremiah's mind wandered to the purpose of his trip. He was heading to a conference where he'd be speaking about creating opportunities in underserved communities. It was a cause close to his heart, one that had driven him since he was a young man growing up in a tough neighborhood. "You've come a long way, Ford," he said to himself, a hint of pride in his voice. But with that pride came responsibility. A responsibility to give back, to lift others up as he had been lifted. Pulling into the airport parking lot, Jeremiah took a moment to center himself. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered a quick prayer for strength and guidance. Opening his eyes, he saw his reflection in the rearview mirror, calm, composed, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As he walked through the bustling airport, Jeremiah felt the familiar mix of excitement and apprehension that came with each trip. People rushed by, some giving him curious glances. He was used to the attention, but it never got easier. Approaching the check-in counter, Jeremiah put on his warmest smile. "Good morning," he said to the attendant, his voice kind and steady. "I'm here for the flight to Chicago." As Jeremiah made his way down the jet bridge, he felt the weight of his day settling on his shoulders. The constant buzz of his phone, the endless meetings, and the pressure of being in the public eye had taken their toll. He looked forward to a few hours of quiet on the flight, a chance to recharge before diving into the conference. Stepping onto the plane, Jeremiah's presence immediately caught the attention of the flight crew. He nodded politely to the pilot standing near the cockpit, then turned towards the first-class section. As he moved forward, he noticed a flight attendant watching him with an odd expression. Nancy had been preparing the first-class cabin when she spotted Jeremiah. Her eyes widened slightly, and she felt a twinge of unease in her stomach. She watched as he confidently made his way down the aisle, his tailored suit and calm demeanor at odds with her preconceived notions. "Can I help you, sir?" Nancy asked, her voice tight with forced politeness. Jeremiah smiled warmly. "No, thank you, I'm in seat 3A. Nancy's lips pressed into a thin line as she nodded stiffly. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. In her mind, people like Jeremiah didn't belong in first class. She found herself wondering how he could afford such an expensive ticket, her outdated views clouding her judgment. Unaware of Nancy's internal struggle, Jeremiah settled into his plush seat. He let out a small sigh of relief as he sank into the comfortable cushions. Placing his briefcase under the seat in front of him, he pulled out a book and set it on his lap. Nancy busied herself with last-minute preparations, stealing glances at Jeremiah every few moments. Her discomfort grew with each passing minute. She found herself double-checking his ticket in her mind, wondering if there had been some mistake at check-in. As other first-class passengers boarded, Nancy's tension became more noticeable. Her movements were jerky, her smile forced as she greeted the other travelers. Jeremiah, absorbed in his book, remained oblivious to the storm brewing in Nancy's mind. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew thick with unspoken prejudice. Other passengers picked up on Nancy's unease, some of them beginning to cast curious glances at Jeremiah. He looked up briefly, offering a kind smile to those around him before returning to his reading. Nancy's internal conflict intensified as she realized she would need to serve Jeremiah during the flight. Her old-fashioned views clashed with her professional training, leaving her feeling conflicted and uncomfortable. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves as the last of the passengers boarded. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Nancy began her routine service in the first-class cabin. Her movements were stiff and mechanical as she pushed the drink cart down the narrow aisle. Her eyes kept darting towards Jeremiah, who sat quietly in his seat, focused intently on his phone. Jeremiah's fingers moved swiftly across the screen as he replied to a series of urgent emails. He was oblivious to the growing tension around him, his brow furrowed in concentration as he dealt with business matters. Nancy's discomfort grew with each passing moment. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As she served drinks to the other passengers, her gaze continually drifted back to Jeremiah. Her hands shook slightly as she poured drinks, causing a few drops to spill on the cart. "Is everything all right?" an elderly woman asked, noticing Nancy's trembling hands. Nancy forced a smile. "Of course, ma'am, just a bit of turbulence." But there was no turbulence. The flight was smooth, and the only disturbance was the storm brewing inside Nancy's mind. Other passengers began to notice Nancy's odd behavior. They exchanged curious glances, following her line of sight to Jeremiah. A few whispered to each other, wondering what could be causing the flight attendant's apparent distress. As Nancy approached Jeremiah's row, her heart raced. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked, her voice strained. Jeremiah looked up from his phone, offering a warm smile. "Just water, please. Thank you." Nancy nodded stiffly, her movements jerky as she poured the water. She nearly overfilled the glass, her eyes fixed on Jeremiah's hands as he accepted the drink. "Is everything okay?" Jeremiah asked, noticing her unease. "Fine," Nancy replied curtly, quickly moving on to the next row. The tension in the cabin was palpable now. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something was amiss. Nancy's agitation grew more visible with each pass through the cabin. Her face was flushed, and beads of sweat formed on her forehead. Jeremiah, still engrossed in his work, remained unaware of the brewing storm around him. He occasionally glanced up, offering polite smiles to those nearby, before returning to his phone. As the flight progressed, Nancy's anxiety reached a fever pitch. Her movements became more erratic, her eyes wild as they darted between Jeremiah and the other passengers. The air in the cabin felt thick with unspoken words and mounting tension. As the flight continued, Nancy's anxiety reached a fever pitch. Her hands trembled as she made her way down the narrow aisle, carefully balancing a tray of drinks. The cabin felt suffocatingly small, and she could feel the weight of curious stares from the passengers. Suddenly, as she passed by Jeremiah's row, Nancy felt something brush against her leg. It was so quick, so light, that she almost missed it. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she stumbled slightly, causing the glasses on her tray to clink together. Time seemed to slow down as Nancy's mind raced. She glanced down at Jeremiah, who was still absorbed in his phone, seemingly unaware of her presence. Had he touched her, or was it just her imagination playing tricks on her? Nancy's breath caught in her throat as she tried to process what had happened. The touch had been so fleeting, so subtle, that she couldn't be sure if it was real or just a product of her mounting suspicion. "Are you all right?" a passenger asked, noticing Nancy's sudden pause. Nancy nodded stiffly, unable to form words. She continued down the aisle, her movements robotic and her mind in turmoil. The incident, whether real or imagined, had pushed her already frayed nerves to the breaking point. As she reached the galley, Nancy set down the tray with shaking hands. She leaned against the wall trying to catch her breath. Her mind replayed the moment over and over, each time becoming less certain of what had actually occurred. The atmosphere in the cabin grew thick with tension. Passengers exchanged worried glances, picking up on Nancy's obvious distress. Whispers began to circulate, speculation running wild about what could have happened. Jeremiah, still engrossed in his work, remained oblivious to the growing unease around him. He typed away on his phone, unaware that he had become the center of Nancy's mounting suspicion. Nancy took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She had to continue her duties, but the thought of passing by Jeremiah's seat again filled her with dread. What if it happened again? What if she wasn't imagining things? With trembling hands, Nancy prepared another round of drinks. She steeled herself, knowing she had to face her fears and continue her service. As she pushed the cart back into the aisle, her eyes darted nervously towards Jeremiah's seat. The tension in the cabin was palpable now, a silent storm brewing beneath the surface. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something was about to happen. Nancy's agitation was clear to everyone, her face pale and her movements jerky. As she approached Jeremiah's row once again, Nancy's heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. She held her breath, bracing herself for what might come next. As Nancy approached Jeremiah's row, her anxiety reached its peak. Her hands shook, causing the glasses on her cart to rattle. The tension in the cabin was thick, passengers sensing the unease radiating from the flight attendant. Suddenly, without warning, Nancy's fear and suspicion exploded into action. She whirled towards Jeremiah, her face contorted with anger and accusation. "You!" she shouted, her voice shrill and trembling. "How dare you touch me?" Before anyone could react, Nancy's hand flew through the air. The sharp crack of her palm against Jeremiah's cheek echoed through the cabin. The sound seemed to hang in the air, a moment frozen in time. Jeremiah's head snapped to the side from the force of the slap. His eyes widened in shock, his hand slowly rising to his reddening cheek. The entire cabin fell into a stunned silence, the only sound the low hum of the plane's engines. Passengers gasped, some rising from their seats to get a better view of the unfolding drama. Whispers quickly spread through the cabin, a mix of confusion and disbelief. Jeremiah, despite the shock evident on his face, remained remarkably composed. He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Nancy's with a calm intensity. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady and clear, "I assure you, I did not touch you. There must be some misunderstanding." Nancy stood there, her chest heaving, her hand still raised. The realization of what she had done began to dawn on her face, mingling with the anger and fear that had driven her to act. The other passengers watched in stunned silence, the tension in the cabin palpable. Some looked at Jeremiah with sympathy, others at Nancy with confusion and disapproval. The moment hung in the air, charged with emotion and uncertainty. Jeremiah remained seated, his posture straight, his gaze steady. Despite the red mark blooming on his cheek, he exuded a sense of dignity and control. The contrast between his composure and Nancy's obvious distress was stark. The other flight attendants, alerted by the commotion, began to make their way down the aisle. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, asking what was going on. As the initial shock began to wear off, murmurs of conversation began to ripple through the cabin. Passengers turned to one another, discussing what they had seen, or thought they had seen. The incident had become the focal point of everyone's attention, leaving them all wondering what would happen next. The tension in the cabin reached a fever pitch as Nancy, her face flushed with anger, pointed an accusing finger at Jeremiah. Her voice, shrill and filled with disgust, cut through the stunned silence. "You're nothing but a pervert," she shouted, her words echoing off the walls of the plane. "How dare you think you can get away with this?" Jeremiah remained seated, his posture straight and dignified despite the red mark still visible on his cheek. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the faces of the other passengers. Some looked at him with suspicion, while others seemed confused and skeptical of Nancy's outburst. Murmurs began to ripple through the cabin as passengers turned to one another, discussing what they had seen, or thought they had seen. The once quiet first-class section became a hub of whispered conversations and sideways glances. "I can't believe it," one passenger whispered to another. "He seemed so respectable." "But did anyone actually see him do anything?" Another voice chimed in, doubt clear in their tone. As the accusations hung in the air, the reactions of the passengers began to split. Some eyed Jeremiah warily, inching away from his seat as if he were dangerous. Others looked at Nancy with raised eyebrows, questioning the validity of her claims. "Ma'am, please calm down," a male passenger said, standing up. "Are you sure about what happened?" Nancy whirled on him, her eyes blazing. "Of course I'm sure, I know what I felt." The tension in the plane continued to rise as people began to take sides. Some nodded in agreement with Nancy, while others shook their heads in disbelief. Amidst the chaos, Jeremiah remained a picture of composure. He knew that in this heated moment, nothing he could say would calm the situation. Instead, he quietly picked up his phone, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen as he typed out a message. The other passengers watched him, their reactions a mix of curiosity and judgment. Some interpreted his calmness as a sign of innocence, while others saw it as indifference to the serious accusation. As the commotion continued around him, Jeremiah focused on his phone, his face a mask of concentration. He was acutely aware of the eyes on him, the whispers about him, but he refused to let it shake his composure. The atmosphere in the plane crackled with tension, the air thick with accusations and doubt. As the situation unfolded, it became clear that this incident would not be easily resolved, leaving everyone on board unsure of what to believe and what would happen next. As the tension in the cabin reached its peak, a timid voice suddenly cut through the chaos. "Excuse me," it said, barely audible above the murmurs. I think there's been a mistake." All eyes turned to the source of the voice. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, stood up hesitantly a few rows behind Jeremiah. Her face was pale, and her hands shook slightly as she gripped the back of the seat in front of her. "My name is Emily," she said, her voice growing stronger. "And I think I'm the one who bumped into you, ma'am." Nancy's jaw dropped, her eyes widening in disbelief. "What?" she sputtered. Emily took a deep breath, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I dropped my book earlier, and when I bent down to pick it up, I must have bumped into you. I had my headphones on, so I didn't hear anything. I'm so sorry for causing all this trouble." The cabin fell silent as the passengers processed this new information. Slowly, all eyes shifted from Jeremiah to Nancy, who stood frozen in shock. But I was sure," Nancy stammered, her face turning a deep shade of red. The realization of her mistake dawned on her, and she felt a wave of shame wash over her. Jeremiah, who had remained calm throughout the ordeal, finally spoke. His voice was gentle, without a trace of anger. "It's okay," he said, addressing both Nancy and Emily. "Mistakes happen. What's important is that we've cleared up the misunderstanding." The other passengers began to murmur again, but this time their tones were different. Some shook their heads in disbelief at Nancy's hasty accusation, while others nodded approvingly at Jeremiah's gracious response. Nancy, still reeling from the revelation, looked at Jeremiah with tears welling up in her eyes. I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I shouldn't have. I can't believe I—" The mood in the cabin had shifted dramatically. The tension that had been building earlier dissipated, replaced by a mix of relief and lingering shock. Passengers who had been eyeing Jeremiah suspiciously now looked at him with admiration and sympathy. Emily, still standing, looked around nervously. "I'm really sorry for not speaking up sooner," she said. "I didn't realize what was happening until it was too late." Nancy stood frozen in place, her face burning with shame. The realization of what she had done hit her like a punch to the gut. She looked around the cabin, seeing the judgment in the eyes of the other passengers. Some shook their heads in disappointment, while others whispered to each other, casting disapproving glances her way. Her gaze finally landed on Jeremiah. He sat there, calm and composed, his dignity intact despite the humiliation she had put him through. His silence spoke volumes, and Nancy felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her. I don't know what to say, Nancy stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She wrung her hands nervously, unable to meet Jeremiah's eyes. I'm so ashamed. The other passengers watched the scene unfold, their earlier suspicions now replaced with sympathy for Jeremiah and disgust for Nancy's behavior. Emily, the young woman who had accidentally bumped into Nancy, sank back into her seat, relieved that the truth had come out but still visibly shaken by the incident. Nancy's mind raced, replaying the events that had led to this moment. She had acted without thinking, jumping to conclusions based on nothing but her own prejudice. The realization made her feel sick to her stomach. "Mr. Ford," she began, her voice trembling, "I can't begin to express how sorry I am. My behavior was inexcusable." Jeremiah nodded slightly but remained silent. His lack of response only amplified Nancy's discomfort. She knew she deserved every bit of this humiliation, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. As the moments ticked by, Nancy became acutely aware of the whispers and stares from the other passengers. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, but now she stood exposed as someone who had let her biases cloud her judgment in the worst possible way. Tears welled up in Nancy's eyes as the full impact of her actions sank in. She had not only embarrassed herself, but had also subjected an innocent man to public humiliation, based on nothing but her own prejudiced assumptions. The weight of her mistake felt crushing, and she struggled to find a way forward from this moment. The cabin buzzed with hushed conversations as passengers tried to make sense of what had just happened. The tension in the air was palpable, and everyone seemed to have an opinion on the incident. A middle-aged man in a business suit leaned over to his seatmate and whispered, "Can you believe what just happened? That flight attendant should be fired on the spot." His companion nodded in agreement. It's clear as day that she jumped to conclusions because of his race. It's disgusting. A few rows back, an elderly woman clutched her pearls and shook her head. In my day, we wouldn't have dreamed of accusing someone without proof. Times have certainly changed. Across the aisle, a young college student spoke up, her voice trembling with emotion. This is exactly why we need to have more conversations about racial bias. It's not just about big acts of discrimination. It's about the small assumptions we make every day. Her words caught the attention of those around her, and soon a small group had formed, discussing the incident in hushed tones. But how do we know for sure it was about race? A skeptical passenger chimed in. Maybe she would have reacted the same way to anyone. The college student shook her head. Look at the facts. A successful black man in first class and she immediately assumes he's up to no good? That's textbook racial profiling. As the discussions continued, Jeremiah remained silent, his face a mask of calm. He scrolled through his phone, seemingly unaffected by the commotion around him. But those who looked closely could see the slight tension in his shoulders, the only outward sign of his discomfort. Nancy, still standing in the aisle, looked lost and ashamed. She tried to continue her duties, but her hands shook as she poured drinks, and she avoided making eye contact with anyone. A kind-faced woman in her 60s reached out and touched Nancy's arm as she passed. "We all make mistakes, dear. The important thing is to learn from them." Nancy nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I never thought of myself as prejudiced," she whispered. "But now I'm not so sure." As the flight continued, the incident became a catalyst for deeper conversations. Passengers who had never spoken before found themselves engaged in thoughtful discussions about bias, privilege, and the power of assumptions. "It's easy to say we're not prejudiced," one man said, "but how often do we really examine our own thoughts and actions?" His seatmate nodded. "This whole situation has made me think about times when I might have jumped to conclusions without realizing it. It's uncomfortable to admit, but it's important to face these things." Throughout it all, Jeremiah remained a silent presence, his dignity and composure serving as a powerful counterpoint to the chaos that had unfolded. Many passengers found their eyes drawn to him, marveling at his ability to maintain his poise in the face of such blatant prejudice. As the discussions continued, it became clear that this incident had touched a nerve, forcing many to confront their own biases and assumptions. The mood on the plane had shifted from shock and anger to introspection, and for some, a determination to do better. Emily stood up from her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she made her way towards Jeremiah. The young woman's face was a mix of guilt and nervousness as she approached the calm figure sitting in first class. "Excuse me, sir," Emily said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the plane's engines. I wanted to apologize to you." Jeremiah looked up from his phone, his warm brown eyes meeting Emily's anxious gaze. He offered her a gentle smile, instantly putting her at ease. "There's no need for that," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "You didn't do anything wrong." Emily shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "But if I had spoken up sooner, none of this would have happened. You wouldn't have been accused like that." Jeremiah gestured for Emily to take the empty seat next to him. She hesitated for a moment before sitting down, her shoulders tense. "Listen," Jeremiah said, his tone kind but firm. "What happened wasn't your fault. You didn't intend to cause any trouble, and you came forward when it mattered. That's what's important." Emily wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "But you were treated so unfairly. How can you be so calm about it?" Jeremiah took a deep breath, his eyes briefly scanning the cabin before returning to Emily. Getting angry or holding on to resentment won't change what happened. It would only add more negativity to an already difficult situation. His words seemed to have a calming effect on Emily, and she visibly relaxed in her seat. "The best thing we can do now," Jeremiah continued, "is to learn from this experience and try to make something positive come out of it." Emily nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "You're right. I just wish there was something I could do to make it up to you." Jeremiah chuckled softly. "You already have. By coming forward and telling the truth, you've shown integrity. That's something to be proud of." As they talked, other passengers nearby couldn't help but overhear their conversation. Many were struck by Jeremiah's composure and wisdom, especially in the face of such injustice. His ability to forgive and find a teachable moment in the situation was truly remarkable. Emily's tension had completely melted away by now, replaced by a sense of admiration for the man beside her. "Thank you for being so understanding," she said. "I think a lot of people could learn from your example." Jeremiah smiled warmly. "We're all learning all the time. The important thing is to keep an open heart and an open mind." As Emily returned to her seat, a hushed whisper began to ripple through the cabin. It started at the back of the plane, where a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair leaned over to his seatmate, his eyes wide with recognition. "Do you know who that is?" he asked in a low voice, nodding towards Jeremiah. "That's Jeremiah Ford. He's not just any businessman. He's a billionaire philanthropist." The woman next to him gasped softly. "Are you sure?" The man nodded, pulling out his phone and quickly searching for an image. "Look," he said, showing her the screen. "He's famous for his work in racial equality and charity. I can't believe he's on our flight." The news spread like wildfire through the cabin. Passengers leaned across aisles and turned in their seats, passing the information in hushed tones. The atmosphere in the plane shifted palpably as the true identity of the man Nancy had accused became known. "Did you hear?" a young woman whispered to the elderly couple in front of her. "The man that flight attendant slapped? He's Jeremiah Ford, the billionaire who's always in the news for his charitable work." The elderly woman's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my," she breathed. "That poor man, and to think how he was treated." As the revelation continued to spread, the mood in the cabin grew increasingly somber. Passengers who had been uncertain about the situation now felt the full weight of what had transpired. Many cast guilty glances towards Jeremiah, who remained oblivious to the stir he was causing, still focused on his phone. A teenager nudged his mother. "Mom, isn't that the guy who started that big scholarship program for underprivileged kids?" he asked, pointing discreetly at Jeremiah. His mother nodded, her expression a mix of awe and regret. "Yes, honey, and to think he was accused like that? It's awful." The gravity of Nancy's actions began to sink in for everyone on board. What had initially seemed like a tense but isolated incident now took on a much larger significance. The fact that a man of Jeremiah's stature and reputation had been subjected to such treatment struck a chord with many passengers. Murmurs of disbelief and disappointment filled the air. Some passengers shook their heads, while others engaged in quiet discussions about prejudice and snap judgments. The revelation of Jeremiah's identity had brought the issues of racial bias and unfair treatment into sharp focus, making the incident feel even more poignant and disturbing. Nancy stumbled into the galley, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the counter. The weight of what she'd done crashed over her like a tidal wave. She felt sick to her stomach, her face burning with shame. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. The realization of her actions hit her hard. She had accused an innocent man, slapped him, and humiliated him in front of an entire plane full of people. And why? Because he was black and sitting in first class? Nancy's mind raced, replaying the incident over and over. She saw Jeremiah's calm face, his dignified response to her baseless accusation. She remembered the shock in Emily's eyes as the young woman confessed to accidentally bumping into her. I'm racist," Nancy admitted to herself, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. It was a hard truth to swallow, but she couldn't deny it any longer. Her actions hadn't come from nowhere. They were the result of years of unchecked prejudice and assumptions. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought about all the times she'd made snap judgments based on someone's skin color. How many people had she hurt without even realizing it? How many opportunities had she missed to learn and grow? "I've been so blind," she murmured, wiping her eyes with a trembling hand. The guilt was overwhelming. Nancy felt as if she was seeing herself clearly for the first time, and she didn't like what she saw. She had always prided herself on being a good person, but how could she claim that when she carried such harmful biases? As she stood there, grappling with her emotions, Nancy knew she couldn't hide in the galley forever. She had to face what she'd done. But the thought of going back out there, of facing Jeremiah and the other passengers, filled her with dread. How do I make this right? She wondered, her heart heavy with remorse. She knew an apology wouldn't be enough to undo the hurt she'd caused. This wasn't just about one mistake. It was about a lifetime of prejudice that she needed to address. Nancy took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She realized that this moment, as painful as it was, could be a turning point. It was a chance for her to confront her biases, to learn, and to do better. "I have to change," she said softly, determination creeping into her voice. "I have to be better." With that thought, Nancy straightened up, wiping the last of her tears away. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to take the first step. It was time to face the consequences of her actions and begin the hard work of confronting her own prejudices. As the revelation about Jeremiah's identity spread through the cabin, a palpable shift in the atmosphere occurred. Passengers who had initially eyed him with suspicion now looked on with a mixture of awe and shame. The hushed whispers grew louder, filled with admiration for the man who had handled such a humiliating situation with grace and dignity. "Can you believe it? That's Jeremiah Ford, the billionaire philanthropist," one passenger whispered to another. "I've read about him. He's done so much for underprivileged communities," another replied, shaking his head in disbelief. The once tense air in the cabin now buzzed with a different kind of energy. People craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of Jeremiah, who remained calmly seated, seemingly oblivious to the stir he was causing. Nancy, who had been hiding in the galley, slowly emerged, her face pale and drawn. As she stepped into the aisle, she immediately sensed the change. The looks directed at her were no longer uncertain or questioning. They were filled with judgment and disappointment. She overheard snippets of conversations as she moved through the cabin, each word feeling like a blow to her already fragile state. "I can't believe she accused him like that," one passenger muttered. "And he's done so much good in the world," another added, shaking her head. Nancy felt the weight of her mistake pressing down on her, threatening to crush her. The realization that she had not only wrongly accused an innocent man, but had also insulted someone who dedicated his life to helping others made her feel sick to her stomach. As she passed by Jeremiah's seat, she couldn't bring herself to look at him. The shame was too overwhelming. She heard a few passengers discussing his latest charitable project, their voices filled with respect and admiration. "Did you hear about the scholarship program he started for inner-city kids?" one woman asked excitedly. "Yeah, and didn't he just open a community center in that struggling neighborhood?" her seatmate replied. Each word of praise for Jeremiah felt like an indictment of Nancy's actions. She had let her prejudices cloud her judgment, leading her to mistreat a man who had done nothing but good for the world. The contrast between Jeremiah's accomplishments and her own narrow-mindedness was stark. Nancy realized that her mistake went beyond just this one incident. It was a reflection of a deeper, more insidious problem within herself. As she continued her duties, moving through the cabin with her head down, Nancy couldn't escape the murmurs of the passengers. Their words, filled with admiration for Jeremiah and disappointment in her actions, followed her like a shadow. Nancy's heart raced as she stood in the cramped galley, her hands shaking as she tried to pour a glass of water. The reality of what she had done was sinking in, and with it came a wave of fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "Oh God," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the hum of the plane's engines. "What have I done?" She knew the protocol. As soon as the plane touched down, there would be an investigation. Her actions wouldn't just disappear into thin air. Nancy's stomach churned at the thought of facing her supervisors, of having to explain why she had slapped an innocent man, a black man, based on nothing but her own prejudice. The glass of water trembled in her hand and she set it down before she could spill it. Nancy leaned against the wall, closing her eyes and taking deep breaths, but even that couldn't calm the storm of worry in her mind. "I'm going to lose my job," she thought, her chest tightening with each passing moment. "Everything I've worked for, gone in an instant." It wasn't just her job she was worried about. Nancy thought about her friends, her family. What would they think when they heard what she had done? The shame burned hot in her cheeks as she imagined the disappointment in their eyes. As she stood there, paralyzed by fear and regret, Nancy could hear the murmur of passengers discussing the incident. Their words, though muffled, felt like daggers to her heart. She knew they were talking about her, judging her. "I can't face them," she thought, panic rising in her throat. "I can't face anyone." The rest of the flight stretched out before her like an eternity. How was she supposed to continue her duties? To look those passengers, to look Jeremiah in the eye after what she had done? Nancy's mind raced with possibilities. Would she be arrested? Would this incident make the news? The thought of her face plastered across TV screens and newspapers, labeled as a racist, made her feel sick. As the fear and anxiety swirled within her, Nancy realized she had never felt so alone. She was trapped in a metal tube thousands of feet in the air, with nowhere to run from the consequences of her actions. The flight continued in an uneasy silence, the tension palpable throughout the cabin. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, stealing glances at Jeremiah and then quickly looking away. The usual hum of conversation had been replaced by hushed whispers and the occasional clink of ice in a glass. In the galley, Nancy leaned against the wall, her heart still racing. She knew what she had to do, but the thought of facing Jeremiah filled her with dread. How could she possibly apologize for such a terrible mistake? The words seemed inadequate, no matter how she tried to form them in her mind. "I have to make this right," she whispered to herself, trying to summon the courage she needed. Meanwhile, Jeremiah sat quietly in his seat, his expression calm but his mind churning with thoughts. This wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Each incident, no matter how small or large, left its mark on him. He thought about the countless other black men and women who faced similar situations every day. How many of them had been wrongly accused, judged, or worse? The weight of these experiences settled heavily on his shoulders. Jeremiah's gaze drifted to the window, watching the clouds pass by. He wondered how many more incidents like this it would take before real change happened. His work as a philanthropist suddenly felt more urgent than ever. As the flight attendants prepared for the final descent, Nancy took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't let this moment pass without at least trying to make amends. With shaking hands, she smoothed her uniform and stepped out of the galley. The walk down the aisle felt like the longest of her life. Each step brought her closer to Jeremiah, and with each step, her heart beat faster. Passengers watched her approach, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Nancy stood before Jeremiah, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Nancy's face was flushed with shame, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Mr. Ford," she began again, her voice shaky but determined. I want to apologize for my actions earlier. I was wrong, terribly wrong." Jeremiah looked up at her, his expression still unreadable. He didn't speak, but he gave a small nod, encouraging her to continue. Nancy took a deep breath and went on, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I acted without thinking. I let my biases cloud my judgment. I jumped to conclusions that were unfair and hurtful. I'm so sorry for accusing you and for slapping you." The passengers around them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked away, embarrassed by the raw emotion of the moment. Others leaned in, eager to hear every word. "What I did was inexcusable," Nancy continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I know now that I have prejudices I wasn't even aware of, and that's no excuse. I treated you unfairly, and I'm truly, deeply sorry." As she finished speaking, Nancy stood there, vulnerable and exposed. The apology hung in the air, and the silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the cabin seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how Jeremiah would respond. Jeremiah sat still, his eyes fixed on Nancy. His face remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps understanding, perhaps sadness. The seconds ticked by, feeling like hours to Nancy and the watching passengers. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers glanced at each other, then back at Jeremiah and Nancy. Some leaned forward in their seats, straining to hear what might come next. Others fidgeted nervously, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Nancy stood there, her heart pounding. She had said what she needed to say, but now, faced with Jeremiah's silence, she felt more vulnerable than ever. Would he accept her apology? Would he lash out in anger? The uncertainty was almost unbearable. As the moment stretched on, the suspense continued to build. Jeremiah's response, when it came, would shape not just this moment but potentially the lives of everyone involved. The entire cabin waited, suspended in time, for Jeremiah to break the silence. After what felt like an eternity, Jeremiah finally broke the silence. His voice was soft but firm, carrying easily through the hushed cabin. "Thank you for your apology, Nancy," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "I appreciate your willingness to admit your mistake." He paused, gathering his thoughts. The entire cabin seemed to lean in, hanging on his every word. "But an apology is just the first step," Jeremiah continued. "What's more important is recognizing the biases that led to this moment and committing to change." Nancy nodded, her eyes wide as she listened intently. "We all have biases," Jeremiah explained, his gaze sweeping across the cabin. "Some we're aware of, others we're not. The real challenge is acknowledging them and actively working to overcome them." His words seemed to resonate with everyone listening. Some passengers nodded in agreement, while others looked thoughtful. "True growth," Jeremiah went on, "comes from reflecting on our actions and taking concrete steps to become better people. It's not always easy, and it doesn't happen overnight." Nancy's shoulders slumped slightly, realizing that this wasn't going to be a simple matter of apologizing and moving on. "I can't offer you instant forgiveness," Jeremiah said, his tone gentle but firm. "That wouldn't be fair to either of us. What I can offer is encouragement to use this experience as a catalyst for change." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Nancy's face. "Take this moment, Nancy. Reflect on it. Learn from it. And most importantly, let it guide you towards becoming the person you want to be." As Jeremiah finished speaking, a profound silence fell over the cabin. His words hung in the air, powerful and thought-provoking. Nancy stood there, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. She nodded, unable to speak but clearly moved by Jeremiah's response. The other passengers sat in stunned silence, many of them visibly affected by what they had just witnessed. Jeremiah's words seemed to have touched something deep within each of them, prompting self-reflection and introspection. As the plane began its descent, a palpable tension lingered in the air. The cabin, once filled with heated accusations and shocked whispers, now held a somber quiet. Nancy, her face still flushed with embarrassment, moved through the aisle with newfound humility. Her movements were careful, almost hesitant as she performed her final duties before landing. Jeremiah sat in his seat, his posture relaxed but dignified. He gazed out the window, watching the landscape below grow larger as they neared their destination. Despite the ordeal he had just endured, his calm demeanor remained unshaken. He took a deep breath, centering himself for what lay ahead once they touched down. The other passengers, now subdued, seemed lost in their own thoughts. Many stole glances at Jeremiah, their eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and shame. Others looked inward, contemplating their own biases and prejudices that they may have overlooked before. As the plane's wheels touched the runway with a gentle bump, Nancy gripped the back of a nearby seat. Her knuckles whitened as she steadied herself, both physically and emotionally. She knew that once those doors opened, she would face consequences for her actions. But Jeremiah's words echoed in her mind, reminding her that this could be a moment for growth and change. The familiar ding of the seatbelt sign turning off broke the silence. Passengers began to stir, reaching for their belongings and preparing to disembark. Jeremiah remained seated, allowing others to go ahead of him. He watched as Nancy moved to the front of the plane, her shoulders set with determination as she prepared to face whatever came next. As people filed past Jeremiah's seat, many nodded respectfully or offered small smiles. A few even paused to shake his hand, murmuring words of support and admiration for how he had handled the situation. Jeremiah accepted their gestures with grace, offering quiet words of thanks in return. Finally, as the last passengers made their way off the plane, Jeremiah stood and gathered his things. He moved towards the exit where Nancy stood, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. As he approached, she lifted her gaze to meet his. "Mr. Ford," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I just wanted to say again how truly sorry I am. Your words, they've given me a lot to think about." Jeremiah nodded, his expression kind but serious. "Remember, Nancy, it's what you do next that matters most. This is your chance to make a real change." With those words, he stepped off the plane, leaving Nancy to ponder the path ahead. As she watched him walk away, she felt a mix of regret for her actions and hope for the future. She knew the journey wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to learn from this experience and become a better person. As the passengers filed off the plane, Nancy stood at the exit, her mind whirling with emotions. The weight of her actions pressed heavily on her shoulders. Once the last traveler had disembarked, she slumped into a nearby seat, her legs suddenly weak. For a long moment, Nancy sat in silence, staring at her trembling hands. The events of the flight played over and over in her mind like a broken record. She saw herself accusing Jeremiah, the shock on his face when she slapped him, and the disappointment in the eyes of the other passengers. "I can't believe of my actions," she whispered to herself, her voice cracking. As the cleaning crew began their work around her, Nancy realized she couldn't stay on the plane forever. With a deep breath, she stood up and made her way to the airport terminal. Each step felt heavy, laden with the burden of her actions. Finding a quiet corner near her gate, Nancy pulled out her phone. Her fingers hesitated over the screen before she typed Jeremiah Ford Foundation into the search bar. As she scrolled through the results, her eyes widened at the scope of Jeremiah's philanthropic work. "I had no idea," she murmured, feeling a fresh wave of shame wash over her. One particular program caught her eye, a volunteer initiative aimed at promoting understanding and equality. Nancy's heart raced as she considered the possibility. Could she really face Jeremiah again? But as she remembered his words about growth and change, she knew what she had to do. With shaking hands, Nancy filled out the online volunteer application. She paused at the reason for volunteering section, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. After a moment of reflection, she began to type. "I recently had an experience that opened my eyes to my own prejudices. I want to learn, grow, and make amends for my mistakes. This foundation's work inspires me to be a better person and to actively combat the biases I now realize I hold." As she hit submit, Nancy felt a mix of anxiety and hope. She knew this was just the first step on a long journey of self-improvement, but she was determined to see it through. This experience had shaken her to her core, revealing ugly truths about herself that she could no longer ignore. "It's what you do next that matters most," Jeremiah's words echoed in her mind. Nancy nodded to herself, a new resolve settling in her heart. She would face the consequences of her actions, but she would also use this as a turning point. No longer would she allow her unconscious biases to guide her behavior. It would be challenging, she knew, but necessary. As she gathered her things to leave the airport, Nancy felt a glimmer of hope. This terrible mistake could be the catalyst for real change in her life. She was determined to learn, to grow, and to become the kind of person who would make Jeremiah proud. Months passed, and Nancy found herself eagerly anticipating her weekly shifts at Jeremiah's foundation. The nervousness she'd felt on her first day had long since faded, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging. As she walked into the community center one sunny afternoon, Nancy was greeted by familiar faces. She smiled warmly at Tyrone, a young man who'd become a regular at the foundation's job training program. "Hey, Ms. Nancy," Tyrone called out. "Ready for another busy day?" Nancy nodded, her eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. "You bet, Tyrone. How's that resume coming along?" As they chatted, Nancy marveled at how far she'd come. Just a few months ago, she might have felt uneasy around Tyrone. Now she saw him for who he truly was. A bright, determined young man working hard to build a better future. Throughout the afternoon, Nancy moved from task to task with ease. She helped elderly Mrs. Johnson fill out her benefits application, tutored a group of children in reading, and assisted in organizing donations for the food bank. Each interaction opened her eyes a little wider to the challenges faced by those around her. During a quiet moment, Nancy found herself reflecting on her journey. She thought back to that fateful day on the plane, cringing at the memory of her actions. But instead of letting shame overwhelm her, she felt a surge of gratitude. That horrible mistake had led her here to this place of growth and understanding. As she sorted through a box of donated clothes, Nancy overheard a conversation between two teenage girls. They were discussing their struggles with racial profiling at school. Nancy paused, listening intently. Their words painted a vivid picture of experiences she'd never had to face herself. "I had no idea," she murmured softly, shaking her head. Later, as Nancy was preparing to leave for the day, she spotted Jeremiah across the room. He caught her eye and gave her a warm nod of acknowledgement. Nancy felt a swell of emotion in her chest, not the paralyzing guilt of before, but a mix of respect, gratitude, and determination. On her way home, Nancy found herself noticing things she might have overlooked before. The struggling young mother on the bus, the elderly man having trouble crossing the street, the group of teenagers being eyed suspiciously by a store owner. Each scene tugged at her heart, reminding her of the work still to be done, both in the community and within herself. As she unlocked her apartment door, Nancy felt a sense of peace wash over her. She knew she still had a long way to go, but she was on the right path. Her experiences at the foundation had opened her eyes and her heart, teaching her to see beyond her own limited perspective. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the community center windows, Jeremiah Ford stood quietly observing the bustling activity around him. His eyes were drawn to Nancy, who was engrossed in conversation with a young mother, helping her fill out forms for childcare assistance. Jeremiah couldn't help but marvel at the transformation he'd witnessed in Nancy over the past few months. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the frightened, defensive flight attendant he'd encountered on that fateful day. Gone was the nervous energy and unconscious bias that had once defined her. In its place, Jeremiah saw a woman filled with compassion and genuine interest in those around her. He watched as Nancy finished up with the young mother, offering a warm smile and a gentle squeeze of her hand. The interaction was small, but it spoke volumes about how far Nancy had come. Jeremiah felt a swell of pride in his chest, not for himself, but for Nancy and the journey she'd undertaken. As Nancy moved on to her next task, Jeremiah noticed the ease with which she navigated the diverse group of people in the center. She chatted comfortably with teenagers, showed patience with the elderly, and exuded warmth to everyone she encountered. It was clear that her time at the foundation had opened her eyes to experiences far beyond her own. Jeremiah reflected on the day Nancy had first shown up to volunteer. She had been hesitant, her eyes often downcast, clearly wrestling with the weight of her past actions. But she had persevered, throwing herself into every task with determination. Week after week, Jeremiah had watched as Nancy's confidence grew, along with her understanding of the communities she was serving. Now, months later, the change was remarkable. Nancy's laughter rang out across the room as she joked with a group of volunteers. Her body language was open and welcoming, a far cry from the defensive posture she'd once carried. Jeremiah could see that Nancy had not only learned about others, but had also discovered new depths within herself. As he continued to observe, Jeremiah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was why he had started the foundation, not just to provide services, but to bridge gaps of understanding and foster personal growth. Nancy's journey was a testament to the power of open-mindedness and the transformative nature of compassion. As the evening wound down at the community center, Jeremiah approached Nancy with a warm smile. "Nancy, do you have a moment?" he asked gently. Nancy looked up from the papers she was organizing, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Of course, Jeremiah. What can I do for you?" Jeremiah gestured towards a quiet corner of the room, and they walked over together. He took a deep breath, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I've been watching you these past few months, Nancy. The change in you is, well, it's remarkable." Nancy's cheeks flushed with a mix of pride and humility. "Thank you," she said softly. "This place, these people, they've taught me so much." Jeremiah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you. Your journey here has been inspiring, Nancy. The way you've opened your heart and mind, it's exactly what we hope to achieve with this foundation." Nancy listened intently, her eyes wide with curiosity. "I have a proposition for you," Jeremiah continued. "I'd like you to invite some of your friends and co-workers to volunteer here. Your story, Nancy, it's powerful. I believe it could inspire others to confront their own biases and work towards building a more inclusive community." Nancy's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. "You really think my story could help others?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jeremiah's eyes crinkled with warmth. "I do, Nancy. Your transformation is a testament to the power of understanding and compassion. It's not just about the work we do here. It's about the connections we make and the growth we experience." Nancy stood quietly for a moment, taking in Jeremiah's words. She thought about her co-workers, some of whom had distanced themselves after the incident on the plane. She thought about her friends, who had listened to her story with mixed reactions of shock and disbelief. I'd be honored," Nancy finally said, her voice growing stronger. "But I'm not sure how they'll react. Some of them, well, they might be hesitant." Jeremiah placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That's okay, Nancy. Change isn't always easy. But if even one person is willing to open their mind the way you did, it'll be worth it." Nancy nodded, a determined smile spreading across her face. "You're right. I'll do it. I'll talk to them and share my experience. Maybe my story can be a bridge, just like this foundation has been for me." Jeremiah beamed with pride. "That's the spirit, Nancy. Together we can create ripples of change that reach far beyond these walls." As they stood there, surrounded by the warmth of the community center, Nancy felt a surge of hope. She knew the road ahead might be challenging, but she was ready to take on this new role. Her journey of growth wasn't just about her anymore. It was about inspiring others to embark on their own paths of understanding and compassion. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as Nancy led her small group of friends and co-workers through the front doors. She could feel their hesitation, but she also saw curiosity in their eyes. Taking a deep breath, she turned to face them. "I know this might feel a bit strange," Nancy said, her voice gentle but firm. "But I promise, this place changed my life. I hope it can do the same for you." As they made their way inside, Jeremiah greeted them with a warm smile. "Welcome, everyone," he said, his eyes meeting Nancy's with a look of pride. "We're so glad you could join us today." Over the next few hours, Nancy watched as her friends and colleagues engaged in various activities at the foundation. Some helped sort donations, while others assisted with tutoring sessions for local children. She noticed the initial awkwardness melting away, replaced by genuine interest and engagement. Sarah, one of Nancy's co-workers, approached her during a break. "You know, Nancy," she said softly, "I wasn't sure about coming here today, but seeing the work you're doing, it's really opened my eyes." Nancy felt a lump form in her throat. "That means so much to me, Sarah. This place has taught me so much about myself and others. I'm just grateful for the chance to share it with all of you." As the day drew to a close, Jeremiah gathered everyone together. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on Nancy for a moment before addressing the group. "I want to thank you all for coming today," he began. "What you've experienced here is just the beginning of a journey towards understanding, compassion, and personal growth." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "You see, change often starts with a single moment. For Nancy and me, that moment happened on a plane. But what matters most is what we do after that moment, how we choose to grow and learn from our experiences." Nancy felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened to Jeremiah's words. She thought back to that day on the plane, how far she had come since then. Looking around at her friends and co-workers, she saw the same spark of realization in their eyes that she had felt months ago. As Jeremiah concluded his speech, the room filled with a sense of hope and possibility. Nancy knew that this was just the beginning, for her friends, for herself, and for the community they were all becoming a part of. If you enjoyed the story of Jeremiah and Nancy, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.